Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Tutun Mukherjee from University of Hyderabad. We shall continue our discussion on post-colonialism. The other module, module number 1, spoke about post-colonial theory, and in that module we explored some definitions of post-colonialism and certain associated terms that come into currency when we talk about post-colonialism. Today we are going to extend our discussion and explore the relationship of certain concepts which figure very importantly in our understanding of post-colonialism. The first such concept is that of the nation. You will know that nation as an idea came into a discourse in the late 18th through the 18th and the 19th centuries in Europe, and post-colonial studies have in fact renewed this discourse on the idea of the nation and the meaning of nationalism. In Europe, the theories of nation gave currency to the thought that nation is the only legitimate political and social form, and the ultimate aim of this theorization of nation, this discourse on nation, this body of literature, was to propose a certain kind of loyalty to the nation state among the citizens. This had followed the change in Europe from its earlier political structure of feudalism into the formation of new republics and new nations. So there were a lot of discussion going on. Contemporary writers who belong to post-colonial discourse like Ben Okri, Salman Rushdie, Bharati Mukherjee, Jamaica Kincaid, Rohinton Mistry, and so many others, who are generally regarded as writers of post-colonial condition, deal with the nation and nationalism, elaborate certain discussions, and try to create a kind of awareness about the different dimensions of this discourse. Recent scholarship on nation suggests a more abstract notion of the nation as a kind of a cultural and a social context, and a symbolic rather than a natural essence, as a nation should be understood. In the post-colonial context, we can make two broad generalizations: that of the colonizers or the Western powers, which had extended its control over territories in the rest of the world, and the colonized people, which is regarded as the rest of the world. So there is this kind of a binary division between the West and the rest. Resistance is therefore a key term to define the new nations that came into being after the passing of colonial control. So resistance is the identifying quality of one's own community that is resisting against the domination by foreign power or even threats of domination. In the context of globalization, today, for instance, resistance could also be seen as an identification with one's own culture, one's own ethnicity, one's own identity against sort of universalization, a sort of glossing over as global culture, and thus there is a suggestion of an existing conflict between an essential understanding of a globalized world as that will efface distinctions and differences, and the desire to hold on to one's own specific cultural, social, ethnic identity. The term national culture is also very problematic for a country like India, where we have many cultures, we have many languages, we have different kinds of social practices, we have different kinds of social cultural communities. So how can we pull all these differences together, efface diversities and impose a national culture upon ourselves? This is very difficult. So nation as an idea, when we talk in terms of the Indian context, is a complex idea, and one has to be very careful in understanding the way this works, that we are a nation despite our diversities, despite our differences. So how do we put it together in an understanding is offered by a theorist, Arjun Appadurai. He suggests, and I will quote, "We need to think ourselves beyond a nation. The role of intellectual practices is to identify the current crisis of the nation as a concept," he says, "and in identifying it to provide part of the apparatus of recognition for post-national social reforms." So what Appadurai is actually suggesting by going beyond the nation is to become a citizen of the world, participate in the nation, at the same time participate in the globe. So what he is therefore suggesting is to become a participant in a world of hybridity. We have discussed this word in our earlier module. So this is the emergence of a hybrid culture in the world that exists today. No culture is now pure as such, originary as such. So it's a hybrid world, and Appadurai says that we must now participate in the nation as well as participate in the world. And in terms of globalization as an economic process, he says this should enable us to use and reuse products of globalization all around the world. Now this is very briefly the concept of the nation. You should read a very important book that talks about the formation of a nation by Benedict Anderson. Imagining a nation, how an idea of a nation is imagined as community of people coming together. So after a brief idea about nation as it works in post-colonialism, we shall move to examine another word which is also very important today, and this word is race, and in connection with it, racism. Race is believed to be a concept that differentiates groups of people on the basis of it. But it is argued in post-colonial theorization that racism, which is a form of ideology, which is a form of a social practice, is a product of colonialism, which creates difference between people. It is directly connected, racism. Race, people belong to different races, but when it becomes, converts, translates into racism, it becomes dangerous, because then it becomes a way of differentiating people and being directly connected to the access to power. The popular concept is that of difference between people of the white race and those of darker races. This has clearly created a classification difference between races. The white races of fair skin color considered superior to the darker races of darker skin color considered inferior. Not only in terms of skin color, but this idea penetrates into intellectual and mental capacity also, and then this becomes very insidious, very dangerous, something to be alert to. The Europeans feared that Asians and the black Persian people would assault them. There was, during colonization, a fear of sexual assault, and this fear created a bigger difference, a bigger gap between races. So how does racism form the basis of colonial discrimination? This question is addressed to some extent by Todorov, a Russian theorist, who explains the word racism in two ways. He says, number one, racism is a behavior of hatred or contempt for individuals who have certain defined physical characteristics as different from one's own. This he calls racism. Second, he says racism is an ideology, as we said before. He says, he defines it as a doctrine concerning human races which might produce racialism. Racism is a phenomenon seen worldwide, creating a sense of difference between people. But racialism is different. According to Todorov, it is a movement of ideas that originated in Western Europe during mid-18th century. Todorov makes certain propositions on racialism. He says, the existence of racism can be explained in two ways, scientific and socio-psychological. Secondly, he says, the cultural difference of a race, which means a collective or a group, can be seen in all individuals belonging to that particular race. However, racialists can often believe that some races are superior to other races. So this is a movement of idea. This is racialism, obtaining from the concept of race, which produces certain ideas of how race performs. So racialism will mean that some races are regarded as superior while others are regarded as inferior. Todorov holds that the contempt between races is based on their physical differences, which percolates, which is expressed sometimes, articulated sometimes as even emotional and psychological, intellectual difference. So race has been a very troublesome, problematic concept, because not because of itself. That is a fact that there are people in the world who belong to different races. But the problem comes when it becomes a factor to create difference among people in terms of racism and in terms of racialism, which means certain ideas getting circulated about differences between races, considering one race superior to another, and these kinds of which is expressed in human behavior. If we think racism is over, then we are wrong, because new racism has come into being, has emerged, which is a new kind of an awareness that is being created. And you should know that this is a kind of a strong bias or a tendency against people of color when there is a kind of profiling on the base of color, on the base of race. So, this is something that is prevailing, something that has not passed, that there is violence still, there is hatred still, which is embedded in the concept of racism and racialism. There is more hidden and difficult varieties of racism which relates to identity of a person. One might argue that race is a political issue. What has it to do with society and culture? So, there should not be any problem anymore. For example, the election of President Obama to one of the highest offices in one of the most important countries of the world should have flagged the idea of race having disappeared. That was indeed a victory to go beyond, to transcend race, but it did not lead to the disappearance of racism or racialism. So, there are people who have who pertain to the thesis of covert racism, hidden racism, and there is also the concept of symbolic racism. These are discussed by a theorist called Snyderman, and in the first proposition of covert racialism, he means that this concept of racism is not displayed, and by the meaning of social symbolic racism, he means that this is expressed in the way people would express their attitude and their behavior. The hypothesis that Snyderman projects is that a single person is the symbol of a race, and therefore that person can be so identified. These are two ways of new racism which prevails today. Another philosopher, Etienne Balibar, he defines new racism as racism without race. What he means is that the concept does not merely rely on biological concept of race, but it falls back on culture. It is true that cultures are hybrid, but it does not mean that they are completely flexible and fluid, Balibar argues. Though there are individual exceptions, he admits it is always that one particular cultural group will prefer that particular group, will be biased or would have predilection for that particular group. So, they will form different cultural communities, and these communities will continue to exist with their own cultural basis, and therefore a society will be automatically divided on the basis of race. So, what has Balibar do? What Balibar does is to make a change, a shift from the concept of race as a biological term and relates it also to the formation of society, that people belonging to different races will continue to have their own racial communities, and therefore race cannot disappear, has not disappeared. They will remain as separate communities of people belonging to a particular race. To sum up then, the 5 central elements of new racism as proposed by theorists are: number 1, the increasingly covert nature of racial discourses and practices, because racism is regarded doubtfully by people. So, discourses of racism have now become more hidden, more covert. The second point, the avoidance of racial terminology, an ever growing claim by whites that they are experiencing reverse racism. So, the white people now claim that there is a kind of reverse racism, that they are being targeted as a group of by the other non-whites. That is also, some theorists say, is an aspect of new racism. Third, the invisibility of most mechanisms to reproduce racial inequality. These mechanisms are in place, but they are not very clearly visible. Fourth, the incorporation of safe minorities to signify non-racialism of policy. So, there is more and more a gesture to accommodate minorities, to make policies appear as non-racist. And finally, the continuous re-articulation of some racial practices. Racial practices do not disappear, they are not erased or effaced, but they resurface. So, these are the 5 points that define the existence of new racism in our world, even in the 21st century. Right. Now, we move on to yet another concept. After having discussed nation and race and racism and racialism, we shall now focus on diaspora. Now, diaspora is a Greek word. The root is a Greek word meaning disperse, disperse of seeds, dispersal of seeds. The Oxford Dictionary defines it as people who have spread or dispersed from their homeland. It was initially used in relation to the Jewish people who dispersed away from their homeland and spread around the world. But when the diaspora relocates, they do not forget their homeland. Therefore, very important to the people of the diaspora are memory and questions of identity. These are inevitable. They always memorialize, they always take recourse to memory of the past, of their homeland, and there is also related to their relocation, displacement and relocation in a new land, which would also be connected with their understanding of identity. The diasporic people derive from all their resources, consciously or unconsciously, to construct their identities. Sometimes in the new lands, they have to assimilate and they have to understand their new context, and there is always a continual process of structuring and constructing their identities. This helps them in transcending their original boundaries of physical, social and cultural kinds. In effect, therefore, the people of the diaspora need to reconcile in the new locations and try to assimilate the physical, social and the cultural components of their new location. The identification of a cultural group or race is not very simple, as there is always a dominant force in the land where they have relocated. They encounter very often oppression, exclusion, subjugation, injustice, the operation of power, but they have to compensate for this by trying to accommodate all these differences and assume their position in the new land. Considering a traditional experience, race produces identity or crisis in identity. So people, when from one race go relocate in another place of a different majority race, so these are some complex issues that have to be encountered for the relocation in terms of diaspora. The idea of black nationalism, for example, is an issue to be considered. There was social and political movement, as we are aware, away from the homeland of the people of original people of Africa of black skin, and they came back to their homeland or thought about their homeland with a kind of feeling, a very strong, powerful feeling, which later became described as black nationalism. So there is one poem, very beautiful poem by James Weldon Johnson, written in the late 19th, early 20th century, in his poem called "A Poet to His Baby Son." Johnson writes, "My son, this is no time nor place for a poet. Grow up and join the big busy crowd that scrambles for what it thinks it wants out of this old world which is as it is and probably always will be. Take the advice of a father who knows you cannot begin too young not to be a poet." So this is an appeal of the father to a baby son to be able to grow up, not lose the imagination, but try to acculturate and accommodate in a new land. Evidently, the speaker is appealing for integration, assimilation, acculturation. But this also is not totally acceptable by all people, because the people in the diaspora do not want to efface the difference entirely. They want to be accepted in the community where they have relocated, yet retain their own community or ethnicity or racist or race kind of identity formation. They don't want to sacrifice in order to assimilate. Another note that we must remember is identity is not an end product. There is always a kind of evolving that happens. Identity is fluid. Identity is always a process. It's never complete. And identity in that sense can transcend place, time, history and culture in the process of continual transformation. So this is a very essential part of the communities of the diaspora who settle in different parts of the world. We know people of Indian origin have settled in different parts of the world. They form the Indian diaspora, and in their writing, they have written beautiful literature about their experience. In their writing, what becomes evident is this process of relocation, the difficulties they have faced and different kinds of problems that they have had to encounter, and the constant process of structuring their identity that must take place. There are different generations also of settlement, diasporic settlements, and there is a difference in the experience of different generations in the locations they have settled in. So this has given us a huge body of writing, which is very interesting and very powerful, because that gives different perspectives of people's lives lived in different locations away from their homeland. There is a person called Rogers Brubaker who gives a different point about diaspora. He argues that there are three main points about dispersion regarding diaspora: the homeland orientation and boundary maintenance. I will repeat. He talks about dispersal, homeland orientation and boundary maintenance, and he confirms that the use of the terms contribute to the loss of discriminating power and involves the risk of being isolated. When he talks about the interconnection between diaspora and memory, he says one might feel very natural, okay, but there are these different senses also which must be acknowledged, that there is a certain kind of distance that has happened with the homeland, and which might bind the people of the diaspora together. So, it is a personal experience that creates a memory in the person, and there is a certain kind of a boundary that is also emerging. Shared memories about a place, people, oral literatures and language create diasporic memory. Clearly, diaspora has its base in memory, but this means that without memory one's diasporic identity is erased. Does it mean that? It does not mean that, because diasporic memory transcends itself, its location, and becomes fused with new locations, and it transforms all the time. It is modified and invented, so it can be remembered. It is the process of formation of cultural identity, memories and histories together, fusing together, the past and the present fusing together to an imagined unity. Imagined, there is not a fixed unit. So, in this diasporic discourse, the issue of home becomes very relevant and a reality, and there is always a kind of a return to homeland. In this context, Avatar Bra defines home as a mythic place of desire in the diasporic imagination. It is also the lived experience of a locality. The diasporic people always make evident in their writing their living reality in fusion with their memory. So, this is what becomes a very important part of the post-colonial understanding of the writing as well, because many post-colonial conditions, circumstances had made people move away from their homeland. So, that is the concept of diaspora and literature of the diaspora that becomes very interesting to read, and very powerful body of understanding the post-colonial condition. Finally, we shall discuss the concept of cosmopolitanism, also derived from the Greek root cosmopolis, cosmos which means the universe and polis which means the city. So, cosmopolitanism is a political and a philosophical concept which puts forward the position that we are all citizens of the world and need not be necessarily understood to be only attached to a nation. Arjun Appadurai, if you go back, if you recollect, talked about this, that we participate in the nation and we can participate in the world. So, cosmopolitanism is a kind of a perspective, a kind of an attitude which transcends the boundaries of a culture, of a society, of even a nation, and makes us participants in a global culture, in the culture of the world. Therefore, it might seem to pose a challenge to traditional views which we have been talking about, that we do not want to efface or erase our ethnic or communitarian or cultural identities, then where is the kind of a contrast? What is this kind of difference that is there in the understanding? It need not be that you sacrifice one to become attached to another. So, one can be attached to a particular ethnicity, culture, identity, yet make an effort to transcend them, to also participate in a global culture, in the culture of the world. There is no dualism here. There is no conflict in these ideas. Derrida, Jacques Derrida, a very important theorist, explains this concept in detail, and he traces it back to the past Greek philosophers, and even to a philosopher of Romanticism, Immanuel Kant, to bring up concepts of democratization and globalization to understand cosmopolitanism. He presents globalization as a paradox. He argues that globalization actually does not take place. He asks if globalization is prevalent between disparities in societies which have different social and economic inequalities. So, globalization is not a uniform kind of a movement, because it encompasses societies which are not of the same economic stature. So, to think of globalization as a kind of universalization would be foolish. So, there are no equal opportunities, no equal commercial or trade partnerships, there is always inequalities. So, we must understand that in terms of cosmopolitanism also, there is space for people of different identities, of different denominations to coexist with the rest of the world. He makes another proposition that wherever it is believed globalization is taking place, it should be understood to be taking place for better and for worse. So, there are different aspects of globalization. There are some positive aspects and there are some negative aspects, and we need not go into detailed discussion of globalization, because there has been much debate on that idea. But for our post-colonial theorization, it is an important concept which can be related to the understanding of cosmopolitanism, which means to go beyond these inequalities and try to make an effort to share in some of the tendencies and the trends of the world. The main points of cosmopolitanism to remember, as proposed by Jacques Derrida, are: number one, it brings forth a sense of sovereignty of a particular state. It transcends the idea of a state, one singular state or local identity, to world state. 3, it is a perspective which could transform ideas of theology, politics, secularity, society, home and identity in a global context. 4, there should necessarily be a balance between the ideas of state as local and state as global. One idea should not stand in opposition to the other. So, this is basically what he means by certain essential qualities of globalization, which should translate to make us into cosmopolitan inhabitants of a world, of a planet that we all share. Finally, we must understand post-colonial studies as offering a method of reading. Now, what we have been talking about are these different concepts which recur in post-colonial discussions. So, post-colonialism is actually a mode of reading which is different from the way texts were read before. So, there is a kind of a shift in the position of the reader, the place of reception of these texts, and reading these texts from the perspectives of all these new concepts that we have discussed, which are, for example, the nation, race, cosmopolitanism, diaspora. So, these are new bodies of literatures that have emerged, new discourses which have emerged, which are talking about writing from a different perspective, from a different location in the reception of these texts. That is what we have been talking about in understanding postcolonial theory. Thank you.